You were never abandoned. You were kept inside a loop you never fully understood. And the most painful part is not that they leave. It is that they always come back. Not once, but again and again, just enough to keep you from letting go, but never enough for you to truly have them. You have felt this before. The way they show up and suddenly everything feels aligned. They speak in a way that makes you feel seen, understood, like finally someone gets you on a level no one else ever has. And just when you begin to open, just when you start to believe this might actually become something real, they pull away, no clear explanation, no real ending, just silence. And you are left there trying to make sense of something that refuses to explain itself. You replay everything, every message, every moment, every word, searching for the point where it went wrong, asking yourself if you said too much, felt too much, expected too much. And slowly, without even realizing it, you begin to adjust yourself, you speak less, you express less, you try to become easier, lighter, less intense, less needy. You start shaping yourself into someone who would not trigger that distance again. And then just as you begin to detach, just as you begin to convince yourself to move on, they return, casually, effortlessly, as if nothing ever happened, as if you were not left there questioning your worth in their absence. And you let them back in, not because you are weak, but because you are trying to understand. You want to believe there is a reason behind all of this, something logical, something fixable. You tell yourself that if you are patient enough, understanding enough, if you just do this right, then it will stabilize, it will finally make sense. But here is the truth, no one tells you. The problem was never that you were not enough. The problem is that you were trying to solve a pattern that was never designed to resolve. You are not in a relationship that is growing. You are inside a system of reactions, a loop where they move closer when they need connection and pull away the moment that connection starts to feel real, and you are there in between, filling the space, becoming the place they return to when they feel empty, and the person they leave when they feel overwhelmed by closeness. And what keeps you stuck is not them, it is the way you interpret them. You are not seeing a pattern, you are seeing potential. You are not seeing avoidance, you are not seeing distance, you are seeing an opportunity to love deeper, to prove something, to hold on a little longer. So you stay, you invest more, you try harder, you understand them more than they understand themselves. And somewhere in that process, you stop asking a very important question. Is this mutual? Because every time they come back, it does not mean they chose you. It means they knew you would still be there. And that is where the shift begins. Because slowly your emotions stop attaching to stability. They attach to their returns, to those short, intense moments where everything feels right again. And without realizing it, you begin living in anticipation, waiting for the next message, the next sign, the next moment where they feel like the version you first met, but that version was never stable. That version was them in a moment of need, not a reflection of who they consistently are. And you fell in love with that moment, not the pattern that surrounds it. And from that point on, you are no longer building something real. You are chasing a feeling, a brief window of connection that disappears as quickly as it appears. And the more you chase it, the deeper you get pulled into the cycle. And maybe for the first time, you need to hear this clearly. You are not stuck because you love them too much. You are stuck because you never saw the loop for what it really is. You start to notice a pattern, but not all at once. It does not hit you like a clear realization. It builds slowly, quietly, through repetition, through moments that feel almost identical, but spaced just far enough apart that you keep treating them like separate events instead of what they really are. A loop. They move closer, they open up, they let you in just enough to create emotional weight, just enough to make it feel real. And then something shifts. Sometimes it is subtle, a delay in response, a slight change in tone, a distance you cannot fully explain. And other times it is abrupt, like a door closing without warning, and you are left standing there trying to understand what just happened. And the first thing your mind does is not question them, it questions you. You go inward immediately, searching for the mistake, analyzing your words, your timing, your reactions, wondering if you misread something, if you asked for too much, if you became too available, too emotional, too invested. This is where the loop tightens, because instead of seeing inconsistency, you see a problem to fix, and that problem becomes you. So you adjust, you start to become more careful, more controlled, you hold back what you feel, you try to predict their reactions before they even happen. You begin managing yourself in a way that feels almost strategic. Like if you can just get the formula right, if you can just say the right things at the right time, you can prevent the distance from happening again. But the distance still comes, always. And when it does not just create confusion, it creates a kind of emotional withdrawal that feels deeper than it should, because it is not just about them being gone. It is about the sudden removal of something your nervous system had already started to rely on. You do not just miss them, you miss the feeling they created in you, the sense of connection, the intensity, the emotional closeness that felt different from anything else. And that is what keeps you hooked. Not the person consistently, but the contrast, the shift from connection to absence, from presence to silence. You start living in that contrast, in the space between what it is and what it could be, constantly trying to bridge the gap. And every time they come back, even briefly, it resets everything. It gives you just enough emotional validation to override all the doubt you felt when they were gone. And suddenly you are not questioning the pattern anymore. You are focused on the moment, on the fact that they are here again, that maybe this time it will stabilize. Maybe this time they will stay, but they do not stay, they repeat. And each repetition pulls you deeper, because now it is not just emotional, it is psychological. You begin forming a dependency on unpredictability, on the intermittent reinforcement of their attention. You never know when they will show up. You never know how long they will stay, and that uncertainty creates a heightened level of focus, a constant scanning for signs, for shifts, for clues that tell you where you stand. You check your phone more often, you reread conversations, you analyze their behavior in a way that starts to consume your attention, not because you want to obsess, but because your mind is trying to find stability in something that is fundamentally unstable. And in that process, something important gets lost. You stop paying attention to how this dynamic is affecting you. You stop asking whether this feels safe, consistent, reciprocal, and instead you start asking how you can make it work. That is the trap, because the more you try to make sense of it, the more you adapt to it, and the more you adapt, the more normal it starts to feel. The confusion becomes familiar. The anxiety becomes expected. The highs feel more intense because of the lows. And before you realize it, you are no longer reacting to what they are doing. You are reacting to the pattern itself. You are anticipating the pullback, even when things are good. You are bracing for silence, even when they are present. You are never fully relaxed, never fully grounded, always slightly waiting for the shift. And this is where self-blame starts to deepen, because you begin to believe that if you were just different, calmer, less intense, more understanding, they would not need to pull away. You internalize their inconsistency as a reflection of your own behavior. But what you are feeling is not a failure on your part. It is the natural response to an inconsistent emotional environment. Your nervous system is trying to create predictability, but it is doing it in a space where predictability does not exist. And the more you try to solve it, the more you stay inside it. Because this is not a misunderstanding that can be clarified with better communication. It is a pattern that operates regardless of how clearly you express yourself. And until you see that clearly, until you stop treating each moment as separate and start recognizing the repetition, the loop continues, pulling you in again and again. Every time they come close, every time they disappear, every time you tell yourself that this time will be different. At some point, if you stay in that loop long enough, you start asking a different question, not just what is happening, but why it keeps happening, why the same pattern repeats even when the people change, why you find yourself in similar dynamics with different faces, different names, but the same emotional outcome, the same confusion, the same cycle of closeness and distance. And this is where most people make a critical mistake. They look for surface level answers. They assume it is about compatibility, timing, communication. They tell themselves that maybe they just have not met the right person yet, or maybe this person just needs more time to open up. But the truth goes deeper than that, because what you are experiencing is not random. It is structured. It is driven by something far more consistent than chance. There is a psychological mechanism underneath this, one that connects both sides of the dynamic, not just them, but you as well. Because on one side, you have someone who pulls away when things become emotionally real. And on the other side, you have someone who moves closer when connection feels uncertain. And when those two patterns meet, they do not cancel each other out. They reinforce each other. The more they withdraw, the more you lean in, the more you lean in, the more they feel the need to create distance. And what forms is not just a relationship, but a self-sustaining loop. And to understand that loop, you have to go back further than the relationship itself. You have to look at where these patterns were first learned. Because for someone who avoids closeness, intimacy does not feel safe. Even if they say they want it, even if they believe they are ready for it, their nervous system reacts differently. It interprets closeness as pressure, as loss of control, as something that threatens their sense of independence. This does not come from nowhere. It is often built early in environments where emotional needs were not consistently met, where vulnerability was not safe, where connection came with unpredictability. So they learned to rely on themselves, to regulate internally, to create distance as a form of stability. So when they get close to someone, especially someone who's emotionally open, emotionally available, it creates a conflict inside them. A part of them wants the connection, but another part of them is activated by it. And that activation leads to withdrawal, not because they do not care, but because their system is trying to restore a sense of safety. And on your side, the pattern looks different, but it is just as structured. You are drawn to connection, not casually, but deeply. You do not just interact, you invest, you tune in, you feel, you try to understand. And when you sense distance, it does not create detachment in you. It creates focus. You move closer, you try harder, you attempt to repair what feels like it is slipping away. And that response also has a history. It often comes from environments where connection was inconsistent, where love had to be earned, maintained, secured through awareness, through effort, through emotional attunement. So you learn to read between the lines, to notice subtle shifts, to anticipate needs, to adapt in order to preserve connection. And that skill, while powerful, becomes a vulnerability in this kind of dynamic because it keeps you engaged in situations where the connection is not stable. You are not just responding to them, you are responding to the possibility of what the connection could become if it stabilizes. And that possibility keeps you invested longer than the reality justifies. So when these two patterns meet, avoidant and empathic, it creates a very specific kind of tension. One person is trying to maintain space, the other is trying to maintain connection. And neither of them is fully aware of the system they are operating in. They both believe they are reacting to the present moment, but in reality, they are reacting to something much older, something encoded in their nervous system, something that defines how they experience closeness and distance. And this is why logic alone cannot resolve it, because it is not just about understanding, it is about regulation, about how safe or unsafe connection feels at a physiological level. You can communicate clearly, you can express your needs perfectly, you can try to create stability, but if the underlying patterns are still active, the dynamic will continue, because for them, too much closeness triggers withdrawal, and for you, too much distance triggers pursuit. And that push and pull creates intensity, and intensity feels like meaning. It feels like something important is happening, but intensity is not the same as stability, is not the same as consistency, and it is definitely not the same as a healthy connection. But when you are inside it, it is hard to tell the difference because your system is activated, your attention is focused, your emotions are engaged at a high level, and that makes it feel real. significant, almost addictive. And that is the part most people do not realize. This dynamic is not just emotional, it is neurological. It involves reward and uncertainty, anticipation and relief. And those cycles create attachment, not necessarily to the person, but to the pattern itself. And until you see that clearly, until you understand that this is not about one moment or one conversation, but about two patterns interacting in a predictable way, you will keep trying to fix it at the surface. You will keep looking for the right words, the right timing, the right version of yourself that makes it work, without realizing that the issue is not in how you are doing it, it is in what you are part of. There is a moment in this pattern that almost everyone misreads, and it is the moment that keeps you stuck longer than anything else, because from your perspective, it feels like hope, it feels like progress, it feels like something is finally shifting in the right direction. But in reality, it is the exact point where the trap becomes invisible. You tell yourself that if you just stay a little longer, if you just understand them a little deeper, if you just respond in a slightly better way, things will stabilize. Because you have seen glimpses of what it could be. You have felt the connection at its highest point, and that feeling becomes your reference, your standard, your proof that something real is possible here. But what you do not realize is that you are not responding to a stable reality. You are responding to intermittent reinforcement, a pattern that does not build consistency. It builds attachment through unpredictability. When someone gives you attention, closeness, emotional intensity in inconsistent bursts, your mind does not relax. It becomes more focused, more invested, more determined to understand how to get that feeling again. And that is where the shift happens. Without you noticing it, you stop asking whether this relationship is healthy, and you start asking how to maintain access to those moments. And this is the part that most people never see clearly, because it does not feel like addiction. It feels like love. It feels like you care deeply. It feels like you are willing to fight for something meaningful, but what you are actually responding to is a chemical loop, a cycle in your brain that is being activated every time they come close and then disappear. The closeness gives you a surge of connection, a sense of emotional reward, and then the distance creates withdrawal, uncertainty, craving, and when they return, that relief feels even stronger than the initial connection. So now you are not just attached to the person, you are attached to the cycle of losing and regaining them. And that cycle creates a level of intensity that can easily be mistaken for depth. But intensity is not depth. Intensity is instability. It is the nervous system trying to regulate something that keeps changing, something that never settles long enough to feel safe. And here is the twist that most people resist when they first hear it. You are not staying because of who they are. You are staying because of how the pattern makes you feel when it peaks. You are chasing a state, not a person. Because if you step back and look at the full picture, not just the highs, but the entire cycle, the confusion, the anxiety, the waiting, the overthinking, the emotional exhaustion, you would never choose that consciously. You would never say yes to a connection that makes you feel uncertain more than it makes you feel secure. But the peaks distort your perception. They give just enough meaning to justify the lows. And over time, your brain starts associating that unpredictability with importance. You begin to believe that because it feels intense, it must be significant. Because it is hard to maintain, it must be worth fighting for. Because it is not easy, it must be real. And that belief is what keeps the loop intact, because now you are not just experiencing the pattern, you are defending it, you are explaining it, you are rationalizing it to yourself and sometimes even to others. You say things like, they are just going through something, they have been hurt before, they need time, they are not used to this kind of connection. And while those things might be partially true, they do not change the structure of what is happening. The pattern does not stabilize just because you understand it more. It continues because it is built on imbalance. And this is where the trap becomes fully invisible, because the more aware you become emotionally, the more capable you are of justifying staying. You can empathize with their behavior. You can see their wounds. You can understand their fears. And instead of that awareness creating distance, it creates deeper involvement. You do not pull back, you lean in, you try to be the safe space, the stable presence, the one who does not leave when things get complicated. But in doing that, you become part of the cycle, not outside of it. You become the constant in a dynamic that relies on inconsistency, and that role keeps you locked in place. Because as long as you are there to receive them when they return, the pattern never has to break. And this is the hardest part to accept, because it shifts the focus away from them and back to you, not in a way that blames you, but in a way that shows you your position in the system. You are not causing their behavior, but you are participating in the loop that allows it to continue. And until that becomes clear, until you stop interpreting the highs as proof of potential and start seeing them as part of the mechanism that keeps you attached, the cycle will keep repeating, not because it is meant to become something more, but because it is designed to keep you engaged exactly where you are. There is a moment when something inside you shifts, and it does not happen loudly. It does not come with a clear decision or a dramatic ending. It starts quietly, almost like a question you can no longer ignore. You begin to notice that the confusion you once accepted is no longer something you can comfortably sit with. The waiting feels heavier, the inconsistency feels sharper, and for the first time, instead of trying to understand them, you start observing the pattern itself. You see how predictable it actually is, how every time things get close, the distance follows, how every return feels familiar rather than surprising, and that familiarity changes something in you. Because once a pattern becomes predictable, it loses its illusion of randomness. And when it loses that illusion, it stops feeling like something you need to solve and starts looking like something you need to step out of. This is the turning point, not when they change, not when they suddenly become consistent, but when you stop expecting them to. Because until that moment, every action you took was based on the belief that if you just did it right, the dynamic would shift, that your patience, your understanding, your emotional depth could stabilize something that had never been stable to begin with. But now, something becomes clear. The problem was never a lack of effort. It was a mismatch in structure. You were trying to build consistency in a system that feeds on inconsistency, and no amount of effort can turn instability into stability if the foundation itself does not support it. And that realization does not make you cold, it makes you honest. You stop romanticizing the highs, you stop excusing the lows, you begin to see the full picture without filtering it through hope. And that is where your power starts to return, not in controlling them, not in changing the outcome, but in how you interpret what is happening. Because interpretation is where your attachment was built, and it is also where it begins to dissolve. You no longer see their return as a sign of progress. You see it as part of the loop. You no longer see their distance as something you caused. You see it as something they repeat. And that shift changes your behavior in subtle but important ways. You respond differently. You do not rush to fill the silence. You do not over-explain your position. You do not try to pull them closer when they start to drift. Instead, you pause, you observe, you give space not as a strategy to make them come back, but as a reflection of your own clarity. And this is where things often become uncomfortable, because when you stop playing your role in the dynamic itself starts to reveal its true nature. They may notice the change, they may reach out in the same way they always have, but this time it feels different, not because they changed, but because you are no longer reacting the same way. The urgency is gone, the emotional pull is weaker, the need to resolve everything immediately is no longer there. And in that space, you begin to see something you could not see before. How much of this connection depended on your participation, how much of it was sustained by your willingness to stay engaged even when it was not giving you stability in return. And that realization can feel unsettling because it challenges the narrative you held onto, the idea that this was something you could fix, something that just needed time, something that had the potential to become what you imagined. But it also brings relief, because if it was not about you doing something wrong, then it is not something you have to keep trying to get right. You are not losing something real, you are stepping out of something repetitive. And that distinction matters because loss implies that something stable existed and is now gone, but what you were in was never stable, it was cyclical. And once you see that clearly, the emotional weight begins to shift. You stop holding on to the past moments as evidence of what could be, and you start seeing them as part of what kept you attached. And that is when your focus changes from trying to bring them closer to understanding yourself more clearly, from trying to maintain the connection to questioning whether it was ever balanced. This is the beginning of reclaiming your position, not by forcing distance, not by cutting everything off in reaction, but by standing in a different level of awareness. Because once you stop chasing clarity from someone who operates in inconsistency, you begin creating it for yourself. And that is the moment where everything starts to change, not on the outside immediately, but internally in the way you see, the way you interpret, the way you respond. And once that internal shift happens, the loop cannot hold you in the same way anymore, because you are no longer feeding it with the same belief that kept you there in the first place. Once that shift begins, the next step is not about doing more, it is about doing less, but in a way that feels completely unfamiliar at first, because everything in you has been trained to respond, to engage, to fix, to close the gap the moment it appears. So when you start reclaiming your power, it does not look like confrontation. It does not look like explaining yourself better. It looks like restraint, like space, like silence in places where you used to react immediately. And that silence is not passive. It is not avoidance. It is intentional. It is the first time you stop participating automatically in a dynamic that once controlled your reactions. Because before, every shift in their behavior triggered a response in you. Distance created pursuit, inconsistency created effort, confusion created analysis. But now you interrupt that pattern, not by forcing yourself to disconnect emotionally, but by changing how you relate to what is happening. You stop treating every signal as something that requires action. You stop assuming that their silence is something you need to fill, and instead you let it exist without trying to control it. And this is where boundaries start to form, not as rules you announce, but as decisions you hold internally. You begin to recognize that access to your attention, your energy, your emotional depth is not something that should be given automatically. It is something that should be met, matched, respected. And that realization shifts your entire position, because instead of asking how you can maintain the connection, you start asking whether the connection meets you at the level you are giving. And that question changes everything, because it introduces a new standard, one that is not based on potential, but on consistency. You are no longer measuring the relationship by its highest points. You are measuring it by its baseline, by how it shows up over time, by whether it provides stability or constantly disrupts it. And when you hold that standard, your behavior adjusts naturally. You respond when there is consistency. You pull back when there is none, not as a tactic, but as a reflection of your awareness. You are no longer trying to teach someone how to treat you. You are observing how they already do and deciding whether that aligns with what you are willing to accept. And this is where emotional detachment begins to take shape, not as coldness, not as indifference, but as clarity. You still feel, you still care, but you are no longer attaching your sense of stability to their behavior. Their presence does not elevate you. Their absence does not collapse you. You remain grounded in something internal rather than something that shifts based on their availability. And that shift is subtle but powerful, because it removes the leverage the pattern once had over you. The unpredictability loses its grip. The waiting loses its intensity. The need to resolve everything immediately fades. You become less reactive, more selective, more aware of where your energy goes and what it returns. And as that happens, the dynamic itself starts to change, not necessarily because they change, but because you are no longer responding in the way that sustained it. They may reach out expecting the same level of access, the same immediate engagement, the same emotional availability, but now there is space where there used to be instant response. And that space reveals something important, because how they react to that shift tells you everything you need to know. If they respect it, if they meet it with consistency, if they show up in a way that aligns with your new standard, then the dynamic has the potential to evolve. But if they resist it, if they push against it, if they try to pull you back into the old pattern through inconsistency, through emotional pressure, through subtle attempts to regain control of the dynamic, then you see clearly what you were part of. And that clarity is not something you need to act on immediately. It is something you hold, something you observe without rushing to fix or explain. Because the goal is no longer to make the relationship work. The goal is to see it as it is, without distortion, without justification. And from that place, your decisions become simpler, not easier emotionally, but clearer logically. You no longer negotiate your needs to maintain connection. You no longer override your discomfort to preserve access. You no longer shrink your awareness to keep someone comfortable. You stand in a different position, one where your presence is no longer something that adapts to instability, but something that requires alignment. And that is what reclaiming power actually looks like. Not control over them, but control over your participation, not forcing an outcome, but choosing whether you remain in something that does not meet you. And once you hold that position consistently, something shifts permanently, because you are no longer someone who can be kept inside a loop without seeing it, without questioning it, without eventually stepping out of it. And then something happens that you never expected, not because it is dramatic, but because it is quiet, almost unnoticeable at first. You begin to feel different, not towards them specifically, but towards the entire dynamic that once held you in place. The same behaviors that used to pull you in no longer have the same effect. The silence does not feel as heavy. The distance does not create the same urgency. The return does not feel like relief in the way it once did. And that is when you realize something has changed, not in them, but in you. Because for the first time, you are not reacting from the same place. You are not interpreting their actions through hope. You are seeing them through clarity. You begin to notice things you once ignored, patterns you once justified, inconsistencies you once explained away. And instead of trying to make them fit into a version of what you wanted, you let them be exactly what they are. And that changes the entire experience, because without distortion, without projection, without the need to turn uncertainty into meaning, the connection starts to look different. It looks less like potential and more like repetition, less like depth and more like fluctuation, less like something building and more like something circling. And when you see it that way, the emotional grip begins to loosen, not because you force yourself to let go, but because there is nothing left to hold on to in the way you once did. You are no longer attached to the idea of what it could become. You are grounded in what it consistently is. And that grounding brings a kind of calm that might feel unfamiliar at first, because it is not driven by intensity. It is not fueled by anticipation. It is stable, steady, almost quiet. And in that quiet, you begin to reconnect with something you lost while you were inside the loop, your own sense of self, your own rhythm, your own emotional baseline that is not dependent on someone else's inconsistency. You realize how much of your energy was tied to waiting, to analyzing, to adjusting, to trying to make sense of something that was never meant to make sense in the way you wanted it to. And as that awareness settles, something else becomes clear. You do not need closure in the way you once thought you did. You do not need them to explain, to validate, to acknowledge the pattern, because you have already seen it for yourself. And that is enough. Because closure is not something they give you. It is something you arrive at when your understanding becomes stronger than your attachment. And from that place, your relationship to them changes completely, not necessarily in how you feel in a single moment, but in how you move forward. You stop looking for signs, you stop waiting for shifts, you stop measuring your value based on their behavior, and slowly, almost without noticing it, your focus returns to you, not in a selfish way, but in a grounded way, a way that recognizes that your energy, your attention, your emotional depth are not things to be given where they are not met. And this is where the final shift happens. Not when you cut them off completely, not when you declare some final decision, but when your desire changes. Because at one point, all you wanted was for them to come back, to stay, to be consistent, to match what you were giving. But now that desire feels different, weaker, less compelling. You are not pulled in the same way. You are not waiting in the same way. You are not hoping in the same way. And maybe for the first time, You notice something that would have been impossible before. You are not wondering when they will come back. You are not even sure if you want them to. And that realization does not come with anger. It does not come with resentment. It comes with clarity. Because once you see the loop for what it is, once you understand the pattern without trying to change it, once you step out of reacting and into observing, something inside you settles. You no longer need the intensity to feel something real. You no longer confuse inconsistency with depth. You no longer attach your sense of connection to something that does not provide stability. And that is where everything shifts, because you are no longer someone waiting to be chosen. You are someone who chooses based on alignment. And when you reach that point, something becomes undeniable, not through force, not through effort, but through awareness. You were never losing them. You were losing yourself in something that could not hold you. And now that you have stepped out of it, now that you can see clearly, now that you are no longer trying to make it work at the cost of your own stability, there is a quiet understanding that replaces everything that once felt urgent. And it sounds like this, not loud, not dramatic, but certain. You do not need them to come back. And maybe for the first time, you would not even choose them if they did.